Hey, Richard Mellor here with Facts for Working People. If I'm doing this, I'm either too lazy to write or I can't write or whatever. But I was thinking of a couple of things. One of them was, it sort of irritates me about Facebook, is people I know and people I don't know get on Facebook and they pontificate, they think this is politics. There are people that I know that have never uttered a word like on the job, let's say. Some of them I've worked with, and or never taken a position on politics. I mean, one guy got angry with me on Facebook, talking to me about calling me a commie and this, that, and the other. And I used to have this paper. Well, I was there for 30 years. You only had to ask me what I was about. I never always shared what my political views were. But now you get on Facebook, it's safe, and of course there's a lot of filth on Facebook too. But what it reveals to me too is there's just a complete lack. More so in this country, I've not been in every country, of working class history. Of course, in any society, the history is the history of the class that rules it. The victor, if you like, writes the history books. I was raised in Britain, and all I knew about the war was from the Allies. I didn't understand completely about what the Russian, the Soviet at that time, Third Front did, we're taught. We grow up in the climate we grow up in, and we are taught the history of the ruling class in the country that we're in. And so, but what we have to know, and what I see a lack of, is in this country in particular, is the history, working class history, and labour history. And when I talk about working class history, I mean the history not just of organised labour. I was active in the trade union movement, and because most people in history have never been in unions, and haven't. Today it's even fewer. But the history of all of the oppressed class, which is the working class, and all those sections of the working class that don't live off the profit of capital, that don't own capital, that are struggling with additional oppressions. The native people, of course, that was the genocidal war against them, black people, women, and all oppressed sections of the working class that face these additional attacks on the basis of color, race, religion, gender, and so forth. But the victor writes the history books, as I say. So in the United States, what we're taught is the history, a capitalist history. You'll always hear about, even when you hear about black history, like where I used to work, and they'd have Black History Month. Well, it wasn't the history of the black working class that played a huge role in the struggle, despite the racism of the trade union movement and the attempts to keep them out of the trade union movement. There's a historic struggle of the black working class. It's normally about a black artist, a black inventor, this, that, and the other, or modern black, successful black capitalists. The history is the history of the capitalist class, and in this country, of the white capitalist, the white male capitalist class. So that's what I was sort of thinking of, and I was thinking if you don't know what I call the history, it's not my term, but the history from below, the history of the working class, then you can't understand events. And it's like if you take, I know Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's very popular. When I was active in the trade union movement, he was like a god to the trade union leadership, the hierarchy of the trade unions, because of the 30s, the social legislation that came out of the 30s, and what have you. And now today you got the Green New Deal now, and the New Deal is a term that's slung around. And what with this degenerate you got in office, Trump. Which in the rise of Trump has a lot to do with the failure of the trade union leadership to provide us with an alternative. Now, apart from people like George Bush being cuddly now, and Michelle Obama claiming he's a partner in crime and she loves him and all of that, because the Trump is such a degenerate human being, the New Deal, we want the people want that back, and they look to FDR. But what was FDR? If you only look at their history, Like if growing up in England, for example, what did I learn about history? This queen, this king married this queen, this king, and it's all just really about dates and times and worshipping the ruling class from the feudal aristocracy. They always keep them in their back pocket. They're useful as a form of tradition, and so we're taught the history of as the governed by the history of the those that govern. And so it took me quite a while to understand that Winston Churchill was not the nice, good man that I thought he was. If you have to ask the Irish or victims of Churchill in the colonial world, you'll understand that. But I wasn't taught that. I was taught different. You have to learn these things, and the important thing is the internet gives us great opportunities. But one of the worst things in this country is the lack of working class history. We've never had a party of our own. With the Labour leadership, I saw Trump the other day talking at a rally of the workers in the federal government. It was just disgusting to listen to him. He was calling on the Senate and the administration, not the House, because that's his Democratic Party friends, and they've taken control of it. This is the other party that has participated in driving down the wages and conditions of the American worker. And so he called on Trump and the administration and the Senate to do their job, quote, so we can do ours. This was the limit of his militancy, as 800,000 workers are working for nothing at the moment. So I can understand why a genuine person who doesn't know anything about the history from below, their own history, our own history as workers, or poor or oppressed people, and things like that. I can understand why somebody, and I sympathise with somebody, say, well, we need what Roosevelt brought. We want a new deal. They look to him, or what have you. I can understand that, but I can understand it more if they take that position. I don't support the Democrats myself. I don't believe in that weaker, lesser two evil policy. But if somebody said, well, they say, well, I hold my nose and I go vote. Somebody says that, I can sympathise with it. I don't agree with it, but I can sympathise. But to glorify this individual shows a complete lack of understanding, because you have to look at what was happening on the ground when this happened, when Roosevelt was dishing out a few minor reforms. Well, you had that depression, the collapse of the economy in 1929. Capitalism was on its deathbed in some ways, and in the early 30s, Roosevelt, I think he came to power in 32. In 33, he started to introduce certain reforms, and that's what we're taught about Roosevelt, that he brought this in, he brought that in. But what was happening, he brought the National Industrial Recovery Act, for example, in, which was a minor concession that they claim give us the right to organise into unions, which is not true. We had that right before, but before then, I think it was the Norris-LaGuardia Act. But what was happening, he brought the NRA in June, the Section 7A, of the NRA in June 1933. Well, prior to that, the working class in this country had already begun to move. There were huge textile strikes. There were huge strikes at the Hudson Body. There were strikes at Briggs. There was actually here in Oakland a strike at the Chevrolet plant in East Oakland there. And where Eastmont Mall is, in that area. And there was a strike there. And my buddy Marvin, his dad, when his dad died, I went to the funeral at the church there. And if I recall correctly, I think his father was the first black worker hired at that Chevrolet plant. So the working class had begun to move even before NRA, which was 5 and 6 months before the NRA in June 1933. And then in 1934, you had 3 general strikes. You had the Auto Light strike in Toledo. You had the Minneapolis Teamster strike in Teamster Rebellions, the book about that by Farrell Dobbs. It's worth reading that book. A great book on how to conduct and win a strike under incredible conditions. Teamster Rebellion, and that was the Minneapolis strike. 40,000 workers in the streets, and then you had the the strike in San Francisco, the San Francisco general strike, and all of these three strikes were led by radicals and socialists. The Communist Party were very influential here in San Francisco. The socialists of the Trotskyist tradition in Minneapolis. I don't know if they were in this. It was a Socialist Workers' Party at that time. And the Mustyites in Toledo. And the Musty was a sort of radical. I think he might have been a preacher. But anyway, there were three major strikes then. So you had what was happening on the ground in the United States at that time was the working class was on the move. NRA did give impetus to increase unionization, but not just for militant unions, but also for company unions. It did increase unionization. But what was happening on the ground was this massive shift of the working class in this country. And then you had the big sit-down strikes in GM, 44 days in 1936-37. They wouldn't come out. The governor threatened the troops. The workers said, bring them in, we'll die. Our blood's on your hands. GM was a murderous, vile corporation, just like all of them, just like Ford, the Nazi. You know, this is Ford, who the Ford Foundation that's sponsored conferences on white supremacy. You gotta wonder about that. It's become such a fashionable term, normally devoid of class content, that Ford has sponsored and endorsed conferences on it. And so you had this huge development. Thousands joined the Communist Party. Capitalism was in crisis at this point in time. And what FDR was, he's got the workers on one end, pushing. He was an astute bourgeois, a more thoughtful representative of his class, and he did gain some. He did face some hatred and a possible coup. There were talks of a coup, even violence against him, and everything else. But he saw what other sections of his class didn't. That if we don't do something, that we're going to lose all. And so the important thing when you're talking about FDR, and the reason I raise it as well, and I'm talking to some of my co-workers and any other working class person from a background, I know I'm from another country originally, like me, that you're coming into thinking about history and history and politics to look at what's happening on the ground, because they don't do anything for us that's not forced. And so that's what he did. He saved capital. He could have nationalized the banks, but he didn't nationalize the banks. He bailed out the banks. And so you have that. That's what happened. And one of the reasons I bring that up also is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She claims a link to him. The New Deal, the Green New Deal. It's not like the Green New Deal from the Green Party, which was much more of a radical document. She claims a linkage to FDR. If he's a radical, that's what I am. And she links to him. Now, she claims to be a socialist. But that's what she's talking about when that's who she's talking about. She doesn't look from below. She doesn't appeal and teach us history in her position now. I believe it's a mistake. She ran as a Democrat and everything else, but she's not talking to the working class, raising our history, the civil rights movement, the massive movement from below there that shook American capitalism and its racist apartheid system in the South, Jim Crow system, shook it to its foundations. She's not pointing to those movements and that we have to repeat those movements and we have to learn from those movements if we want anything at all. So she's looking to the politicians. She's looking to their parties. She's pointing to FDR, and FDR's New Deal failed. There was a deeper recession, a deeper depression in 1937. And what got capitalism out of its mess was the war production. And that's what got capitalism out of the crisis that it was in. 57 million deaths, the smashing of of value and production, the smashing of Americans' capitalism's allies, because the allies had no productive forces at the end of it. Its enemies' productive forces, Germany and Japan, were completely destroyed. That's what saved capitalism from itself. And don't think the nuclear weapons they make today, they don't make them never to use them. We're in a dangerous time. And so what I urge some of my working class people to do is to read our history. And if you're a white person, you read everybody's history. What white people, outside of people that are political, don't read Malcolm X's writings? Why was Malcolm X assassinated? Not when he was calling us devils, not when he was a nationalist and a separatist, but when he was calling for unity of the oppressed against the oppressor. He said there will be a revolution, but not based on the colour of a person's skin. You can't blame him for his early beginnings in this country. If the trade union leadership had fought racism in a different way, he may have gone differently. But the question is that that's what history is. It's history from below. We have to search and read our own history. You know, Lerone Bennett, he has a good book called The Shaping of Black America. I don't know a great deal about him, but the second and third chapters in that book were very, very interesting for me. And I'd like to know actually how in the 30 or 40 years since he's written it, how people, whether it's come under much criticism on its, with regard to his writings about black and white unity as poor indentured servants and what have you in the early beginnings of this country. But he said in a system of oppression, an educator is either an oppressor or a revolutionary. There's no middle ground. And so we have to, if you're getting on Facebook, they're writing about FBR, please read your own history. If you're a working class person. I had a guy at work one day tell me when I came to this country that we'd always had an 8-hour day. I mean, what are you talking about? That we've always had an 8-hour day. But then again, some of them told me when I first came here that a social nationalized health system was communism. It's the class consciousness is very weak here. The influence of the petty bourgeois, the middle class layers in between the big bourgeois and ourselves, most of them wanting to move up, wanting to improve their position, their class position. Their view of the world is very powerful at this present time because we are not in motion in a major way, and it's harmful. Their views are harmful. Some of that class, individuals from those classes, and that's true of the black petty bourgeois and the white petty bourgeois as well. Some of the individuals within those classes are heroic figures in history. They always have been, But the question is, if you're going to write about the 30s and you're going to say FDR was a great guy and you're a working class person, you'd better make sure you read something about the 30s as well. And it's the same with the civil rights movement. Because I remember a black dude at work one time. He's from a middle class family, had a little bit of money. He was a good guy, but he was a little bit overly zealous in his attacks on the black youth in the ghettos here, where I worked in the streets and this, that, the other. And I used to chide him that if it wasn't for them, if it wasn't for the black youth in this country, in the South, that fought against apartheid, fought against an apartheid system, you'd still be waiting tables. You know, I used to do that to annoy him. But you got to see where any gains we have come from. That's the point. I've exhausted myself now. I feel a lot better. Anyway, Richard Mellor, Facts for Working People. Feel free to send me criticisms, send me your thoughts. We got an email on the blog. If you know me, feel free. Anyway, Facts for Working People. Our address is weknowwhatsup.blogspot.com. Okay? Thanks for taking the time to listen to it. Bye.